You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. And I'm joined by one of my favorite co-hosts, one of the smartest guys you'll ever get the chance to listen to, Mr. Silas Kulkarni. Silas, how you doing today, brother?
Hey, it's good to talk to you, John.
It's good to talk to you too, my friend. Always a happy day when I get the chance. And to make the day even happier, we are joined by somebody who I dare say is one of the most interesting people in American politics, in part because, in spite of the fact that he's a very intelligent and insightful guy, is somebody who comes to politics more or less as a regular Joe, looking to make the world a better place, or at least that's the rumor about him, and I imagine he might prove it to be correct. We are joined today by former candidate for the for mayor of New York City, author of the book Forward: Notes on the Future of Our Democracy, and founder of the Forward Party, about which we are going to speak, Mr. Andrew Yang. Andrew, how are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, John. This podcast is just what the world needs. It's awesome to be here.
Absolutely. Well, and just to give a plug really quick, I don't know if you were particularly familiar with Braver Angels prior to jumping on the microphone here today. But of course, as folks listening to this podcast will typically know, we are the largest grassroots bipartisan organization working on the subject of political depolarization here in America. And so that's a subject that we look forward to jumping into with you as well. But Silas, you were good enough, man, to take the initiative to getting Andrew in the house here, for which I'm very grateful. Do you go ahead and start us off? Where should we begin in this conversation with Mr. Yang?
Well, before I jump in, it's important I give a disclaimer, which is just in full transparency. I am a huge Andrew Yang fan. This is not an unbiased interview. I was part of the Yang gang on the internet who supported his presidential candidacy, and I donated money to his campaign. And I also want to be transparent that Andrew Yang supported my brother, who ran for office as Congress. Andrew supported him and was a friend to him. So in all those ways, I'm not an unbiased interviewer, and I thought it was important for me to tell the audience that before we dove in. But also wanted to thank you for that, Andrew, because all those things were both inspiring to me and meant a lot to my family. So thank you for that, Andrew.
Least I could do, Silas. And just so everyone knows, like, I supported his brother Shri without knowing that Silas had supported me. So his brother's a great guy.
Because nobody knows or cares about my political support right now, Andrew.
But there are no quid pro quos.
Yeah, no, his brother really should have won. His brother is still going to do amazing things.
Of that, I'm sure.
All right, well, Andrew, there's a lot to talk about, most notably your recent quitting of the Democratic Party to launch your own new political party, the Forward Party, and the book that you released that talks about that, Forward. But before we dive into that, I think a lot of listeners may have heard of Andrew Yang as the UBI guy, or for those who don't know the acronym, Universal Basic Income, which means giving $1,000 a month to every American. You really popularized that issue through your presidential campaign. But a lot of people probably don't know a lot about you as a person and how you got to politics, how you got to the presidential campaign, the New York mayor campaign, and now to starting a third party, which is a very unusual pathway. And frankly, you're not a typical politician in any sense of the word. So tell us a little bit about you and how you got here.
Well, thanks, Silas. I have a feeling you and I might have some stuff in common. I'm the son of immigrants. In my case, my parents met at students at UC Berkeley in the 60s and 70s. I was born in 75 in upstate New York. Wow, I'm going far back. But I guess, like, I grew up like a lot of children of immigrants, get good grades, try and get into good schools, try and get a good job. And I tried to do those things. I then became an entrepreneur in my mid-20s, unsuccessfully at first, and then had a bit more success in my 30s. And the real left turn in my career was when I decided to start a nonprofit called Venture for America. And that led me on this entire journey of discovering the Midwest and the South to a higher degree, because I hadn't seen a lot of the country. But it also exposed me to the people who are theoretically solving our problems. Like I met 3 of the last 4 presidents, and bunch of other figures, and it did not reassure me that much. Unfortunately, it wasn't like, oh, they've got it. It was more like, whoa, like these people aren't really that focused on problems that I think are really serious, and the machine doesn't permit them to get out there and solve problems a lot of the time. I mean, they have their own sort of vortex of media appearances and fundraising dinners and the rest of it. And so when Trump won, I thought, well, I have a feeling as to why this is happening, and it's happening because of the transforming economy. And I think that we're going to need universal basic income sooner rather than later. And so to me, running for president was actually an extension of my work as a nonprofit leader, where I'd run a nonprofit that I'd started for 6.5 years and did a lot of work I was proud of, but I began feeling more and more certain that you were going to need much, much bigger solutions than my organization was going to be able to provide. So when you ask about me as a political figure, I see myself more as like a problem solver entrepreneur. It's just that most of the biggest problems we have in American life today are going to require some sort of public involvement or government involvement, which might be unwelcome to some people listening to this. I'm sorry. But if you look at some of the really big problems around polarization, poverty, climate change, and the like you're going to need our government to get its shit together, which is highly unlikely. And so then that now has led me back full circle to why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
Andrew, by the way, I should tell you, you may know this already, but one of the core principles of Bravery Angels is the parity principle, which means we have red and blue leadership equally at every level of the organization. I say we because I'm a volunteer and a member of Bravery Angels. But so on this podcast, just so you know, John is a Republican. John ran for Congress as a Republican. I am a Democrat, though we're both heterodox in a lot of ways. So I think you're right to name that there will be people in this audience who come from a very conservative perspective, and that's something we'll be talking more about. So I just wanted to give you that heads up, because that is part of what Bravery Angels is here to do, is bring people with different political opinions together from different sides. Before we get there, though, you kind of buried some of the little early parts of your story. So I wanted to just share a couple of things with the audience that may not have known. So you spent 5 months as a lawyer. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was a corporate lawyer for 5 months in New York, and I've never been older or more unhappy than those months in my 20s. I was like, I gotta quit this job. No offense to people who are still doing that. I get it. I have a lot of friends who are practicing.
Yeah, well, what I saw, so I read through your book as soon as I could steal a copy from my brother, and so I have some sense of your bio from that. But just to share with the audience who doesn't know you, so you grew up son of immigrants, like you said. You go to fancy schools, go to law school like you typically do, and then you quit within 5 months, which is not what you typically do. You did the entrepreneurship thing. You became successful with a test prep company. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then instead of doing more entrepreneurship, you just quit that to go start a nonprofit. And then you ran a nonprofit for a while. And then after a while, you said, no, wait, now I'm going to go to politics. And after doing partisan politics for a while, you quit that. You said, no, now I'm going to create structural change to the political system. So I'm wondering, I feel like there's a through line there that might be interesting to hear from you about. You seem like a kind of guy that keeps working on the next level of the problem. Does that sound fair? And if you could tell us a little bit more about that, because most people are typically going to work within the lanes that they're given, but you seem to keep jumping the lane.
Well, thanks. I was just reflecting on the fact that Forward, my new book, is my third book. And what happened was, as you're suggesting, I saw a problem and then got really animated about it. And then it led me to bigger, hairier problems. So the problem I started out with Venture for America and in 2011, though I wrote a book about it in 2014 called Smart People Should Build Things, is that we had a lot of really bright people doing work that was nonsense and was not going to lead us anywhere good. And specifically, I was thinking about, no offense again, bankers, consultants, lawyers. I was like, we have so many talented people in these fields. And I was like, this is not actually creating all that much value. It's just sanding things down and making them efficient and keeping the wheels turning. So I thought that was the biggest problem. I thought, well, if you could get talent heading to startups and solving real problems, then that would be a million times better than what's happening now. And so doing that work for 6.5 years led me to the fact that, okay, our economy is actually transforming in very fundamental ways. The imbalances are much worse than even I'd imagined. And the only way you're going to be able to get in front of this sort of thing would be something dramatic like a universal basic income. And it turns out that that kind of problem is impossible to implement except through government. And one of the things that happened to me, oh man, this is going to sound kind of, I don't know, jaded, but like when you're doing your thing and you're a normal person running a nonprofit, you think that person's a billionaire. Like that billionaire could solve so many of these problems with, whatever it is, like $10 million of their money or something like that. And then you actually hang out with billionaires and they actually seldom operate in increments of $10 million. Like I'd get a meeting with a billionaire and be like, hey, we're going to rebuild the country through entrepreneurship. And then I'd walk out with like $100,000 or something. And then I'd be like, okay, well, I'm grateful, but like that's not going to do it. Where you start looking at like the magnitude of these problems and you realize that, in a $22 trillion economy, if things are messed up, like you would need the government to go big. So that's what led me to politics. And my 2018 book, The War on Normal People, which is about the progressive dehumanization and automation of labor and universal basic income. And then running for president, you learn a lot of stuff. And I realize now that polarization is going to destroy us, which I believe is one of the premises of this podcast. That is just going to get worse and worse, and we're going to turn on each other and descend into madness. So
that frame it quite so pessimistically, but I think that same problem is what's on their minds.
I don't even think that's hyperbolic, unfortunately. So then I say, okay, what's the problem? What's the solution there? And the solution is to try and shift to a genuinely multipolar, vibrant, multi-party democracy as quickly as possible. Go from 2 parties to, in my mind, ideally 5, 6, or 7. And that's very difficult to do if you have a duopoly that puts the screws to anyone who tries to change anything. so that's where we are now. I feel pressure to try to solve these big problems, in part because I now realize I'm kind of a distinct figure in American life, Silas, where like if there was like a legion of Andrew Yangs and I could just chill out, I'd be much happier. But
you say that, I heard that there are actually a lot of people named Andrew Yang. You mentioned this on some.
There is a legion of Andrew Yangs, actually. In a literal sense, that is correct.
Well, and of course there is, in fact, the Yang Gang. We've got plenty of those folks around to do some of the good work as well, as we are hearing. Andrew, I want to give you the opportunity to tie some major threads together that I hear you talk about in the context of polarization. You've commented a fair amount on the bad incentive structure that leads our politicians, and I would imagine you would also probably include the media apparatus in this, to sort of invest in the perpetuation of a culture of polarization. I think that your commitment to universal basic income and to, broadly speaking, sort of remedying income inequality has to, in part at least, be related to the consequences for social cohesion that come with widening wealth gaps in American society. And I'm curious to know, between income inequality, the structural incentives towards polarization, and the cultural phenomenon of tribalism in American life, how you see these dynamics as sort of interacting to produce the moment that we're in. Because, to tell you the truth, I sympathize with you, Andrew. I mean, I think that there is, if you sort of play it out all the way down the road, a scenario in which, the social fabric unravels in a way that has, violent implications for American society, really. And at the very least, just sort of the grinding to a halt of our institutions' capacity to function in a context where we simply can't communicate and relate to each other as human beings across some of these tribal lines. So go ahead and give us the grand scale analysis that ties these things together, if you will.
When Trump won in 2016, I thought, wow, this is a giant red flag and cry for help, is the way I interpreted it. And when you dig into the numbers, we had eliminated 4 million manufacturing jobs in Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, Iowa, and other Midwestern states primarily. And a lot of those environments went from purple to red very, very quickly. Income inequality is led to financial scarcity and deprivation, which has had an impact on Americans' attitudes and mental bandwidth, where there was one study that showed that having this mindset of scarcity had a functional diminution of your IQ by 13 points or one standard deviation. And so one of the things I'd say to people is like, if you feel like America is getting nastier, more hair trigger, more susceptible to bad ideas and leadership, we almost certainly are, because if you put people in a position of having to worry about how to put food on the table or whether they're going to make rent or choosing between healthcare and fuel and other costs, then they become less generous, more tribalized, more polarized, et cetera. So the economics are driving the culture is driving the economics. It's all a perpetuating loop that's going to get stronger and stronger, which is why, again, I don't think you and I are being hyperbolic, John.
Right, indeed. So granted that these things are in play, I'm curious to know if you see there as being sort of, is it the case that the answer to this question is primarily technical, or in the area of structural reform? So my approach to dealing with the issue of polarization is oftentimes sort of rooted in kind of shifting culture as it exists within civil society, which is something of a conservative sort of starting point in some sense. Not in a definite way, but sort of, tends towards that instinct. And a huge part of what we focus on at Braver Angels is not advocating for policy outcomes, but creating the space for the sorts of conversations rooted in a mutual kind of recognition of human dignity that are structured, that can facilitate best practices, that can be exported to college campuses, corporations, local communities, so on and so forth. I guess what I'm getting at here is, do you see, sort of one approach or the other as being more important, less important than the other? Or is there a way in which these things have to be able to sort of join hands in a holistic vision of how we ultimately sort of solve the problem? Isn't it possible we could have UBI, but still have the basic problems of tribalism in American society that prevent us from being able to sort of function in the context of democratic society?
I love what you're describing as the work, having structured conversations, bringing people together, humanizing folks that may have different political beliefs. I think that is being lost. And I agree that that is a necessary part of us maintaining some sort of integrity as a society. I think that the technical solutions I describe around something like UBI can feed into an environment that is more receptive and open to those kinds of conversations. And it's probably true in reverse, where if people were having those kinds of human interactions and realizing that we have so many common problems, you'd probably see more support for something like UBI. I think the two things do go hand in hand. And I'm enormously excited that you are trying to export this to environments that could really use it, which is just about everywhere, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I definitely say that that's correct. And, I said UBI and I said, technical solutions and so forth, but I'm also thinking about the larger platform of the Forward Party. And Silas, you may want to jump in at this point, but I know that Andrew is advocating, and the Forward Party is advocating for changes in the way we actually do elections, which is definitely at the front of many people's minds in terms of how we can create a less polarized environment, ranked choice voting, open primaries. Silas, is there anything you want to add on this front, or do you want to angle our intro into this particular
topic? I'd love
Andrew
to just tackle the question head on. How in the world is starting a third party going to solve this polarization problem? Because everyone listening to this podcast will agree that polarization is a big problem. But how will a third party do much of anything about that?
What's fun is that the third party is championing process change that would diminish polarization very, very quickly. What the heck am I talking about? So the example I use in real life right now is Senator Lisa Murkowski, who's been in the news a lot lately. as the only Republican senator who both voted to impeach Donald Trump earlier this year and is up for re-election in 2022. It's a rare combination. Right. So her approval rating among Alaskan Republicans is now 6%. It genuinely is political suicide to go against Trump in this way. But Senator Murkowski still has a fighting chance for re-election next year because Alaska shifted also last year from closed party primaries, which we're all accustomed to open primaries and ranked choice voting. So instead of having to go through the party primary, which would include just 10 to 20% of the most extreme partisans, in this case, Republican partisans, Senator Murkowski can take her case to the entire Alaskan people. And that, I'm going to suggest, is a very different landscape than the 10 to 20% most extreme partisans. So if we were to do the same thing around the country, you would see politicians make very different decisions, be much more prone to compromise, because they would have to come back to their district and make the case to 51% of people what the heck they did. And right now, that is not the game at all. Right now, in 83% of the districts that are very blue or very red, the game is just to try and placate and please the most extreme partisans in your community and avoid getting primaried. If you avoid getting primaried, you get to the general, you win. That's one reason why you have 92% re-election rates for individual members. The seats are safe on one side or the other, which leads to polarization. The political incentives right now are rewarding folks for blaming the other side, retreating to your corners, and they'll punish you for trying to solve a problem. If you actually propose some kind of middle of the road solution and the other side agrees to it, you will be cast out. And so really, one of the main themes of both my book and the party is that we should not expect this system to produce results because it's not designed to produce results. It's designed to reward people who play politics and are increasing our polarization, not decreasing it.
Mm-hmm. So just to be clear, is your third party focused primarily on this issue of ranked choice voting and open primaries? Is that the core issue?
That's the core issue, in part because it's almost impossible for any third or fourth or fifth party to emerge if you don't have open primaries and ranked choice voting. Because if you have a closed party primary, and again, if 83% of the districts are safely in that camp, then it's almost impossible for someone to contend unless they're kind of a meteor, like Evan McMullen might be a meteor in Utah, but that's not the norm. Happily, though, and this is one of the exciting things, is that the Forward Party does not need to win 51% of races to determine policy. If we had one or two senators, you could actually make a case that might be enough. The same might be true in the House. So we're going to be supporting candidates around the country. And if you have open primaries and ranked choice voting, you'd have a much more genuinely representative lowercase d democracy. And it's fun when you talk like what's the primary mission of the Forward Party? In some ways, the primary mission of the Forward Party is to allow any third party to prosper and exist.
This is interesting and unusual. Like I want to hold on this point because this is really interesting and unusual.
Go for it.
This sounds like this is a sort of meta party. It's a party that creates other parties or a party that allows other parties. And if that's the case, I think it would be great to hear you trace that out a little bit for the audience. One, so it sounds like you're trying to move the country from a two-party system to a multi-party system. Is that fair?
Yeah, because the duopoly is a design flaw that will have catastrophic consequences. We're already seeing it. The founding fathers would be horrified that we're actually stuck with a 150-year-old duopoly. John Adams called it a great evil that the Constitution enables to have a two-party system. And it also makes us very susceptible to authoritarianism, where if one major party succumbs to bad leadership, then it can become a real existential concern. Whereas if you had a system like the UK with 5 parties, or Germany with 7 parties, or Sweden with 8 parties, then one party succumbing to bad leadership is an issue, but it's not like the issue, because then the other 7 parties look around and be like, all right, let's wait for the 8th party to get its act together. but it's not like they run everything. Whereas here, they can run everything, and they can also say, well, we're better than the other people. And in a polarized environment, people will agree with that.
And were you trying to get in? I'm very interested in this point about changing our system, and I think a lot of our listeners probably are. But it seemed like you were trying to get in, John, so I wanted to give you a chance there if that was where you
Well,
were.
I was just going to mention that, when I ran for Congress in 2014, I ran in an open primary process in the state of California. And if for me, I loved it because I ran for office really sort of to be a bridge between the different sides. And, I was somebody who had worked on the Obama campaign, became politically more conservative, but still sort of believed in this idea of sort of a post-partisan, post-racial sort of Obama 2004 era, like DNC speech kind of politics. And so I ran as something like of a hope and change Republican, if you will, which made me a unicorn among unicorns. Nevertheless, running an open primary
That's what I
process.
was calling you, John, is just a unicorn.
There you go. There you go. Nevertheless, running in the open primary gave me an opportunity to campaign early on among Democrats and independents, which is what I wanted to do anyway. But many of my fellow Republicans really didn't like the open primary process, particularly within activist circles, because in a state, certainly in a city like Los Angeles, which is overwhelmingly Democratic leaning, it meant that you had outcomes where you had the same party represented on both sides in a general election. Can you speak to that? Is that not sort of a valid concern that ultimately an open primary process can sort of narrow your choices in terms of the general election stage, and in that way sort of cut other parties out or cut the other side out when it matters most?
That's one reason why you need it in conjunction with ranked choice voting. I think that California has half of the solution, where open primary is good, but cutting it to 2 candidates for the general, in my mind, is too small. What we are proposing is that 5 candidates make it through to the general and then are determined via ranked choice voting. If you're not one of the top 5 candidates and you're a Republican, then, and if you have ranked choice voting, then you could have 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, an independent, a forwardist. And then there's no spoiler effect because, if you're a Democratic voter, you can just vote 1 Dem and then the other Dem and then leave. And so it's not like right now with the plurality voting system where if you had 2 Dems, it would cannibalize each other and then theoretically the Republican would win. So I just think that the final 2 candidates is too restrictive to your former colleague's point that we should let more people through to the general.
Got it. Okay, Silas, jump back in.
Yeah, Andrew, I'm realizing that a lot of the audience probably don't even know what these terms mean. Open primary, ranked choice voting. Can you give like a, Andrew's, politics 101 class? Just give us a basic. You don't have to go into great detail because people can read up online, but just for people who don't know what the heck we're talking about.
Closed party primaries are primaries like they have in New York City, where you need to be a registered member of a particular party in order to vote in it. And in New York City, it was very restrictive, where you had to change your registration to Democrat 4 months ahead of the election. So if you were looking up a few weeks before the election, it's like, oh, too late. so that's not unusual around the country. An open primary is a system where you don't need to be registered to a particular party in order to participate. Which I'm going to suggest should be the point. It's more inclusive. You don't need to be hyper on the ball. And ranked choice voting is also called instant runoff. It's a system where you're allowed to express your preference for multiple candidates. And the first candidate who gets more than 50% of top choice votes wins. So there's so many positives to ranked choice voting. Number one, it gets rid of the spoiler effect, as I mentioned. It makes it so that you have to build a broad coalition, because if I get 30% of people really excited about me and everyone else hates me, I don't win. So it kind of rewards moderation. It rewards coalition building. So if someone's walking around with 5% support on an issue, then you actually really want to try and integrate that issue and get that support. Whereas right now you might not care that much. It discourages negative campaigning, because if I trash you, we both look kind of bad, and then a third person benefits. So there are a lot of pluses to ranked choice voting. And if you combine these two, it would make for a much more powerful, genuinely representative system. And oh, by the way, it also
Sorry, Andrew, just for the sake of the audience. So is the basic idea, I go into the ballot booth and I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order the way I like them? Is that the basic idea of ranked choice voting?
That is the basic idea, but you have no obligation to do so. You can just vote for your top choice, number 1, and walk out. You can rank 2 candidates. And in New York, 95% of people found the system very, very easy. About 90% ranked multiple candidates. About 80% want to do it again. I think the number was 77%, which, or in New York City, it's pretty much unanimous. I mean, you can't really get higher than that.
And can you give us a sense of where this has been tried, Andrew? I mean, you mentioned New York. I think most Americans, to Silas's point, still aren't really too familiar with the ranked choice idea, although, this idea is certainly gaining currency, as is evidenced by your own efforts. But where has this been tried? What kind of data do we have on the way in which people may interact with it?
We have some great data from city races. San Francisco, Minneapolis, St. Paul, all have used it. And then on the state level, Maine has used it in statewide races, and Alaska just adopted it. So the data is very promising around all of the benefits I described. We just have to mainstream it. It's one of my big goals. And I think that it's funny talking to you all about this, John, because just the way my brain works, it's that there are all of these people, I think, who are listening to this podcast who want our system to be more sane and rational and reasonable. And my great contribution is to say, our system does not reward any of those things. So what we should do is actually make it so it does.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, well, Silas, I have a subject in mind, but I don't want to cut you off if you've got something else.
No, I think this has been good. I mean, the two things that are really on my mind from here are there's 1,000,001 objections that people raise, and frankly, getting ready for the podcast, I went and Googled and was flooded with a wave of them, including some people who are frankly pretty nasty. But nonetheless, nasty or not, there are a lot of objections out there to a third party or to these structural changes to move to multi-party democracy. And I think that just engaging those objections is a really important part of the conversation. And then, John, you and I probably both want to talk about the issue of racial politics, particularly the connection to the intellectual dark web, which is and the heterodox movement, because I think that's a place where Andrew's been very popular and where John, you have a lot of relationships. So there are two things on my mind. Are those on the radar of what you want to talk about, John?
Yeah, absolutely, definitely.
So I'll let you steer there, and then we can loop back around to whichever ones we don't cover right off the bat. Sure thing.
So Andrew, so you ran for president of the United States, which I know is, just having run for Congress and so forth. I mean, you've been through a gauntlet that, few people will experience. And then you turned right around and ran for mayor of New York City. But I remember seeing you getting traction in sort of the digital media space, the Heterodox community. Sam Harris's podcast, I think, was an important appearance in sort of bringing your brand and style of politics to public awareness. And, I've the Weinsteins and Joe Rogan and that sort of universe of commentators who assembled this audience that was left-leaning, right-leaning, but universally dissatisfied with the tribal irrationality of our politics. That seemed to be fruitful soil from which the sort of, much of, I would imagine, of the Yang Gang seemed to be born. I think that there's a divide in American politics today that is not necessarily starkly right and left. To some degree, it tracks that. But you have, in part, I think, sort of a dynamic in our politics wherein you've got many folks who want to preserve traditional liberal norms, who value free speech, intellectual inquiry, a transcending perhaps of racial categories and perhaps partisan and religious categories. But then we've also got strong populist movements which go in a different direction. There is, of course, the sort of Trump phenomenon, wherein you've got sort of an America First perspective that is radically distrustful of the institutions. But then you also have, I think, a sort of a social justice movement in American life, which sees a lot of those traditional liberal norms. And Silas, you may or may not characterize some of this a bit differently, but I think you have a social justice movement in American society that sees a lot of those traditional liberal norms as actually sort of muting the implications of the lived experience of different, particularly marginalized or traditionally marginalized groups of Americans. And they're pushing a style of politics that is quite at odds, I think, in some respects at least, with the sort of, let us value free speech and, sort of open debate and so forth style of political engagement that many folks are used to. both as a presidential candidate and as an ordinary American, as you interacted with the American people, sort of across the spectrum, what is your experience of sort of engaging people kind of emotionally and psychologically from these different starting points? Did you find yourself able to converse with people in each of these different areas? As our first, sort of prominent Asian American candidate for president, was the racial question put to you in a way that was particularly salient? Talk to us about your journeys among sort of this spectrum of the sort of cultural perspectives of the American people.
Oh, I like your description of those communities. Certainly, I owe an enormous debt to Sam Harris in particular, but other members of what you consider this intellectual internet audience building. And I feel like in some ways the bifurcation is inside the establishment, outside the establishment, or institution slash ex institution. and people sense that I was a fairly normal person slash not a machine politician. And I do think that a lot of people embraced me because it seemed like I was coming at things from a particular perspective that made sense to them. I found myself able to interact with people in each of these communities quite naturally. Like I would hang out with Trump voting truckers and they were fine in person, warm, generous, curious. I would talk to Black activists in various environments, and they also I got along with very well. They liked me and saw that I was genuine and sincere. Most of the time, if you are in person, that is the dynamic that gets built. Because it just turns out we're much less nasty in person. Like if I were to try the same exercise online, you probably get a different result. But I spent the better part of 2 years just walking around Iowa and Ohio and New Hampshire and various other communities. And so you just run into people all over the place. There were some people that would ask me in a diner, I'd be like, hey, running for president. They'd be like, really, which party? And I'd say Democrat. They'd be like, oh, like that, there'd be like this visceral reaction. Like, and I'd be like, no, I'm not so bad or whatever. So there was some of that. One of the things I will say too, is that my race did not have much of an impact that I could discern on my interactions in places like Iowa and New Hampshire. If anything, it became much more prevalent in a place where the racial dynamics were different, like in a place like New York City. But if you're in a majority white environment in the Midwest, it doesn't come up because there's not any degree of racial insecurity or animus. Like people are just accustomed to being around people like themselves, and then you show up and they're like, oh, like you're a person too. So that's something that I think a lot of folks who are in like the liberal environments might not believe, is they think that if you go to a majority white Midwestern place that all of a sudden everyone's racist. And I did not find that to be the case at all.
Yeah, Andrew, I want to, if you're open to this, I'd like to talk more about this. It's an area that you and I share, this kind of immigrant background growing up in America. And, before I read your book, watching your campaigns and public speeches, I'd never heard you talk about race at all, except maybe in the context of like, that UBI helps people of all races, but like, and, you just didn't engage it. And I'll just tell you from my perspective, I've spent most of my career advocating around issues of racial equity. So like, I wouldn't quite agree with John's characterization of the current movement, though we obviously agree on many things. I just want to read a couple segments from your book that really stuck out to me and weren't what I had heard in your campaign. So this is just from the beginning. You were talking about your early life experience. I skipped a grade, kindergarten. So as I went through school, I was always smaller and scrawnier than the other kids in my class. As one of the only Asian kids in the school, I took a lot of abuse. I got called gook and chink and long duck dong, which I didn't understand until I saw 16 Candles, which I thought was funny. All I wanted to do was fit in, but that seemed like wishful thinking. And then you come over to the next page and you're talking about, I spent a lot of my childhood shy, angry, and trying to do anything possible to avoid being a nerd. When challenged, I would fight, generally on the losing side. I felt like the outsider in most any situation. That all sounded super familiar to me. Like I just was like, wow, that, like I remember, the guys in the lunchroom in my high school would just stand there and yell racial slurs at me and try and goad me into a fight. And I always be like, oh, like I think so later in the book you mentioned feeling like your masculinity was always on the line. And like that's like, for people who don't know, that's like the most classic stereotype thrown at Asian American men is like, you're like a nerd and you're not a man, and you're like, things about genitalia get thrown in there that I'm not going to go into on the podcast, but it's like, it's ugly shit, and you talk about all that. From my perspective, it's surprising to me that you don't carry a lot of bitterness with that. And honestly, when I look at a picture of you in high school where you're like dressed like a goth, and it's like really funny, awesome picture for anybody who hasn't seen it, Google Andrew Yang goth high school picture. It's great. But it sounded like there was a lot of bitterness there. And like, frankly, I have experienced a lot of bitterness around those experiences I went through growing up. I grew up in Texas, which is a different place, but you were in New York. Sounds like you got some of the same. And yet you come into politics with, if you feel like the guy that can be nice to anybody, that can be forgiving of people, even when they are a bit racist. And I'm just wondering, how does that fit together? How do you go through the world having experienced some of the things you described there, and then come out being, as what seems to me, generous of spirit as you seem to be in your political orientation on questions of race?
Well, part of it is, it takes some time. I mean, like I'm a 46-year-old dad, and the rest of it. But in my teenage years, very angry, very angsty. And in my 20s, I was one of those angry Asian dudes who was in the gym all the time,
I also study martial arts, so I can relate.
Yeah, really, really angry and working through it, I suppose. Like you work through it in your own way for like a decade. And I think that all of those experiences fueled this desire I had to achieve or do something significant or be a baller or whatnot. And a lot of it, was trying to find a date or like find a partner. And then, I met my wife when I was 31, and then we settled down, had kids. I ran a company, and I mellowed out some, I suppose, and I get it when people have been through tough things where, it's like, because like, let's say hypothetically, it took me like 18 years to like process these things in a way that is like moderately productive. And so if someone is in year 4 or 5, like I don't begrudge them that, because, I was pissed off too, or hurt or wounded, and I had a lot of things going for me during that arc that if things had gone differently, would have been very difficult. Like when I started trying to be an entrepreneur and then failing, like that was very difficult, and it shattered my confidence, and I felt really bad about myself, and like my self-worth and masculinity was again in question because I was a failure and stuff like that. I try to be grateful for the fact that things have worked out generally pretty well for me. And I am acutely conscious of like the marginalization and suffering that people go through. It's just in large part, I'm trying to be as productive as I can be. And one of the things I try to convey to people is like, look, let's say we agree that the problems, like how are we going to actually get a solution across the goal line? And I'm going to suggest that it's not necessarily dwelling on all the things that differentiate us from each other. Like even if I happen to know that some of those things are very real, and it's like I'm just like a very practical, results-oriented type of person. And no, but I mean, I appreciate that you think that I come across as generous of spirit. I try to, but it wasn't overnight, that's for sure.
Well, I mean, there's something I have to say here that just really struck me as you were talking. But when you described this trajectory of being like sort of kind of treated terribly, largely on account of race, and I didn't mention it, but I also heard stories about your father in there, and that resonated with me as well, because my dad was a very talented guy whose ambitions were thwarted for reasons of race in a kind of overt way. And then going, meeting a beautiful, wonderful woman, getting married, having kids, eventually having career success, and you kind of rise. And you get to a certain point where you can look down on it from a position of, hey, I made it, like I started in a place where people didn't treat me with respect, but now I have a position of respect in society. The thing that really struck out to me and unlocked something for me is this is a classic immigrant narrative. You have, Italians coming here or Irish coming here, and people throwing rocks at them as they get off the boats. If everybody's ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, you're like, oh, it wasn't so nice for the Irish back then. you know, and that as you start to make a place for yourself in this country and you rise and you get some of those successful parts of the American dream, suddenly you can start to say, hey, I can let go of some of that. And what strikes me is that I hadn't ever put this thesis together before, but it strikes me that for many Americans for whom these racial issues are the most bitter, it's the ones who that upward cycle isn't happening. You know, you don't have the same intensity of sense that race is a defining issue for people who, you know, have multi-generation moved up the ladder. But for people, you know, I taught in inner city schools. That was my professional career. I was in educational equity. And for most of the kids in my school, it wasn't one generation of poverty or two generations of poverty. It was since slavery. You know, like, you know, and that notion that your family has been poor, always will be poor, and when people treat you like crap because of your race, you're never going to get to be the place where you can be like, well, I'm the boss now, so you know, I can shrug it off. You know, like I run the company. You know, you're like, well, you know, I'll be in Section 8 housing, and I'll get you know, stopped and frisked, and I'll get looked at like I'm a criminal when I walk in the store if I'm there to buy something with my money. You know, like, and so I just wonder how you relate to that issue of. I mean, to me, it seems like part of what's the cushion to your early life, really tough experiences that I relate to is your later life successes. And I just wonder, what do you make of this other section of American society who later life isn't going to be full of those successes?
I'm someone who wants to try and make things better for folks who are marginalized and struggling with circumstances that really, you know, have nothing to do with them as an individual. Like they're born in a certain neighborhood, like their school underperforms, like they don't have meaningful opportunities, don't have mentors, don't have role models and the rest of it. I mean, I'd love to try and break that chain. You know, I'm like motivated by that vision and mission. One of the big things though, Silas, is like there are different ways for us to just talk about that mission. You know what I mean? And that's one of the things that I confess to finding a little bit tough is that at this point, and this is one of the learnings in my book, is that all politics is tribal. And then you're discussing what tribe you're from based upon certain terms and language and coded expressions and the rest of it. And I did not realize this to the extent that perhaps I should have when I was running for president. And so what I did is I stumbled upon a new political language, and it's just the way I talk. You know, it's it's just like, to me, having like facts and figures and caring about automation of jobs and AI and solutions and whatnot. And that activated a certain body of Americans, not 51%, but, you know, like whatever the percentage is, I estimate 10 to 20%. And then we have to try and make something of that tribe as quickly as possible with some of the goals that I think more of us share than are against, you know what I mean? And that's based upon the fact that I've spoken to thousands of Americans from every walk of life, from, you know, rural counties to big cities. And things are getting worse and nastier. And it's going to get worse unless we do something significant around the structure. And so there's so many people that are very passionate activists who are engaged in the work, and I appreciate the heck out of them. And like, I don't think we're being set up to succeed. Truly, I think we're being set up to destroy each other. And so, you know, like I'm going to try and play my role in American life, which is to provide this third way around structural reforms that will enable people to get more done.
Yeah, indeed. You know, that was really interesting. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, Andrew, though I'm certainly looking forward to doing so and encouraging our listeners to do so as well. I had not heard the anecdote which Silas had just recounted until now. But part of what I detect in, I think, the way, you know, you're sort of engaging, you know, this question around the way in which we describe ourselves politically, relating it to tribes and so forth, and the need for us to be able ultimately to focus on the practical solutions that can make life better for everybody. You know, it points to me to this fact that on the one hand, we do think about politics as being about solving problems, or at least like it should be. On the other hand, there's this reality that people sort of want to see themselves, at least a great many people, sort of emotionally and, culturally to one degree or another, yeah, in their politicians, in their leaders, and perhaps just as a part of wanting to feel like their own struggles are identified with. People seek to have a real emotional connection with many politicians, and whether you're talking about Trump and his supporters or Obama and his supporters and so forth, that need to have sort of like a personality be a conduit for a larger shared experience, right, seems to be a powerful driver, and it can lead to serious irrationality. I think we can all agree these tribal instincts are exploited all of the time. But I did feel a little bit of magic in hearing you and Silas just now sort of compare each other's experiences. And I wonder if there's not something to be said for the importance of biography and sort of relating to the struggles of the American people. I'll say about myself really quick that, I'm a mixed kid. My mother is African American from inner city Los Angeles. My father is Anglo American. He's from Tennessee originally. He comes from great wealth. She comes from a much more modest background. I got, some of the racial jokes, some of the mixed kid jokes and so forth. But overall, I grew up in a very sort of well integrated kind of community. And I was from the suburbs. My life as a Black American was much different than most of my Black cousins who actually came from the hood. I grew up speaking a different way. I had a different sort of, general kind of disposition. My relationship to institutional society wasn't nearly kind of like this troubled. And I can say that in comparison between me and many white kids as well, because I knew a white kid or two who came from the sticks, came from poor, rural backgrounds. And I never thought they had it as well as I did either. A lot of things in American life seem to be sort of class oriented, but it overlaps with these sort of racial conversations. And what I'm wondering, and what we're trying to build at Brave Angels in part, I think, assuming it's possible, is a culture of conversation that allows us to unearth our lived experiences, let's say, identify with one another's struggles, but then, find a way of framing our relationships to each other as people and as Americans in a way that transcends that honors where we're starting from,
Yeah.
but allows us to get to the place of true community where we can reason together. And I'm just wondering, what do you think of that formulation of the project?
I think it's so necessary. I love it. I'd love to help, truly. And I think that being able to acknowledge each other's humanity and the struggles that I think are essentially either universal or nearly universal is important, in part because we should not let those struggles like define what we can and can't do, in my opinion. And that's something that I'd love to have people be able to share. It's like, look, we've been through things, and in the scheme of things, I think one of the mistakes we all make is like essentially just trying to figure out like, well, who's had it shittier between like, among the three of us, like, who's had the roughest? Or like, oh, I had this, I had that. It's like, okay, I get it. That
The impression Olympics, right?
yeah. It's like after you get through that, it's like, okay, like now what? Now what are we going to do? And right now I want to focus on the now what, first and foremost, which is not necessarily the most popular political approach, to your point. So when I was running for president early on, I had all these people around me just being like, you're terrible. Like, you need to like not talk like you talk. You need to not like all the stuff. It's essentially like, you're like the worst politician. And I think they were probably correct by conventional standards. And I'd go to these political events and then people just be yelling out Democratic talking points, and we go like, yeah. And then I'd go and do my thing, and then it'd be like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this, but like polite applause and the rest of it. So that it's for better or for worse, generally for worse, like politicians kind of respond to their incentives. It's like if I gin up the tribalism and gin up my own narrative of like overcoming adversity and the rest of it, then like you build that connection like you're describing, and I don't know where that leads us. It's not necessarily where you want to go.
And Andrew, before we run out of time, I'm gonna I'm going to feel bad if we don't get some of the core things that people are wondering about a third party out there. So I do want to, if you're willing to play a little game with us.
Yeah, no problem. I understand you're serving as a mouthpiece to others. You don't necessarily like hold all these objections. It's fine.
Well, no. I appreciate that, but that's what I was going to ask. Actually, was do you mind doing it like a lightning round? Because there's a lot of questions that are out there, and I feel like you have like kind of a straightforward answer to a lot of them. And I would like to just get as many of them out there in this little segment as possible.
Throw some fastballs, Silas, down the middle of the plate.
You okay with that? I mean, I know it's kind of a weird.
Yeah, no, it should be fine.
Yeah, because I mean, I think there's at least 10 or 15 questions that are floating out there, including some that have been submitted by our members that I'd love to ask you, which means you'll probably have to answer them in like 10 seconds, not a minute.
I get it.
Okay, cool. Okay, so big first question. Anybody says about a third party, isn't this going to have a spoiler effect? You know, people think about Nader in 2000 or Perot in 92.
Number one, people for whatever reason are obsessed with a presidential. Like we're going to be involved in many, many local races, probably the primaries where this is not an issue. But the single biggest way we can make this moot is shift to ranked choice voting and then make it so there's no more spoiler effect, which by the way would also be enormously beneficial on multiple levels around improving incentives.
Okay, going a step further. Aren't third parties unrealistic in America? Won't we always end up back with a two-party system? A lot of people have tried it before. Libertarians, Greens, now American Solidarity Party, or the Working Families Party, just to name a few.
We are now at a record 62% of Americans who want an alternative to the duopoly. The duopoly is dysfunctional. It's not working. We all know it. So really, this argument is essentially like, can't change anything, we're doomed, even though no one's loving the duopoly. Again, you have like 28% approval of Congress, 62% want a choice. I mean, can America not rejuvenate itself? And for people who think that a third party is not feasible, like, let's shift to open primaries and ranked choice voting and let like the people actually decide, who and what they want to support. Like, why is that a bad thing? You know what I mean? Just like, let's like figure out what it is that people actually want. But 62% of people want an alternative. It's higher than ever.
Okay, but 62% of people want an alternative, but they all want different alternatives. In fact, we played this game at a party recently. What's the party that you would make up? And they're amazing. It was a diversity that you couldn't imagine. How could you have a unified third party?
You don't need a unified third party is my point. It's like, hey, whatever party you want, let's actually make it possible by shifting to open primaries and ranked choice voting. There are going to be libertarians that are like going to be all about this. They're going to be Green Party all about this. Like anyone who wants any kind of political dynamism or variety should be for making this shift. Oh, and by the way, it's going to save us from civil war and ruin. Like, I'm just going to throw that in there.
Why a third party and why not a PAC that just advocates for ranked choice voting and open primaries?
In large part because of my discovery that politics is tribal, that if you want to initiate a popular movement, you need to create a banner for people to join. The fact is that there are already nonprofits and PACs who are working in this direction, but what they don't have is popular support or mainstream awareness. So that's what we're going to provide. Though technically, I will suggest also that right now we are a PAC because it turns out you can't start a political party from day one. You have to satisfy a bunch of FEC tests.
So you're a progressive associated with the Democrats. You ran as a Democrat in two different races. Why would conservatives or Republicans want to join your party or back you?
Conservatives and Republicans actually have a higher appetite for third party alternatives than Democrats. 42% of the people who were supporting me during the presidential run were not Democrats. So even when I was running as a Democrat, a lot of people were like, oh, this Yang fellow actually makes some sense. And there are Fox viewers that have said to me or my supporters, my friends and my family, like Yang is the only person that I would support of that field because he does not judge me. And they're right. I don't judge them. I don't judge anyone. I don't think anyone's better than anyone.
From one of my Trump supporting friends who actually had heard about you and actually did have, by the way, very favorable opinion of you. And by the way, when I say Trump supporting friends, that's a very Brave Angels thing. You don't have that in any other context. That's one thing I like about this organization. Mm-hmm. But he asked, so for a Republican who liked Donald Trump, but thinks that third parties are there, what solutions do you have besides something like UBI that don't cost trillions of dollars?
So open primaries and ranked choice voting and third parties, you can support them even if you support Trump and you're Republican. The forward party is inclusive of registered Democrats, registered Republicans. It's just a more genuinely effective democracy. And a lot of Republicans are very drawn to this idea around the fact the founding fathers did not like political parties. They were certainly, they'd hate this duopoly. A lot of conservative Republicans actually back Trump because he's kind of ex-institutional. And that's what, in some ways, the forward party is trying to do too, is try and give people a real voice. When they ask about solutions, the thing I'd say is that what I want people who are of any party to have is just goals and drive towards them. And so some of the Republican goals that I am very sympathetic to are entrepreneurship, rates of family formation, volunteerism, philanthropy. I think these things are great. America standing in the world, sure. There are things that we can have as goals, and then as long as we're actually trying to move in that direction, then that's where the party should be arguing really their case.
I've got a
lightning round, and then I'm going to pass it to you, John, because I want to get these out there. Are there any prominent conservatives who are allied with you right now, or who you're working with, or is it all Democrat or Democratic-leaning people who are working with you in your team?
There are a lot of independents, certainly, who are super excited about it. And I'm getting messages from conservative Republicans every day that they're saying, like, conservative Republican here, and I've been waiting for something like this. Because there's something very patriotic about this movement that conservative Republicans are attracted to. Getting a lot of ex-military, military veterans, law enforcement, people like that supporting forward.
And then second to last question on the lightning round, and John, I know you've got some substantive ones, but I want to get these are substantive, but they're fast. And this is a harsh question. I don't feel this, but I just want to say it because I've heard a lot. I've read on the internet. Is this new party just Andrew Yang's self-promotion, selling books?
Well, I mean, honestly, this would be the dumbest means that one can think of. Really, it would be a very irrational path to take. Let's put it that way. I mean, there are ways to sell books without putting yourself through the ringer of building a third party in an environment where there are a lot of folks who are going to be resistant for whatever reason.
Okay, last lightning round question, and then John, I know you got a meatier thing that you've been chewing on. What are 5 songs that you would rock out to if you really wanted to rock out?
I tend to think of 80s music in this regard. I'm a huge Prince fan. So if you think of 5 songs, I'm just going to go like How Soon Is Now, The Smiths. God, I mean, Cure is not really rocking out, but like,
you're very emo, Andrew.
No, it's very emo. It's not very good. So I feel bad saying that. Like, I was just going to say Just Like Heaven by The Cure. I mean, these are songs that I grew up with. Prince, Let's Go Crazy, or like 1999, or Little Red Corvette, any of those. But
those are good.
Yeah, I guess I just chose 3 Prince songs, so I guess we're up to 5 already.
Okay, we'll let you off with the hook on that one. I'll pass it back to John. Thank you. Sure. And by the way, that was a great lightning round. I actually really appreciate you getting some of those just basic ideas out there for people. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, brother. Thank you very much. And no, big Prince fan here. They used to call me Prince back in high school, actually.
There's a bit of a resemblance, John. You look,
Well,
you're very good looking, and Prince is very good looking. So,
Well, I mean, back then I also had an afro, and I used to wear jean suits with the collar pop. So there was a little bit of there was a great resemblance back in those days. Unfortunately, my friend, we are about out of time here. But I do want to thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us. I think this has been a special conversation, and my great hope is that we can have you back and get you further involved in the project to depolarize America, build a house united. I mean, obviously, you're pursuing this on your own front, but of course, we are interested in being a part of and expanding that coalition of Americans who are working to bring the country back together. Can we get you involved?
For sure, John. And one very short-term thing is like let's have you on my podcast really as soon as possible, and you could talk about what you're doing, because I think it's what the country needs. And let's get your message out too. Your message is trying to bring different people together from different backgrounds and walks of life. I mean, it's what a lot of Americans are looking for.
And it's not just a matter of feel-good conversations. It is a matter of the future of democracy. To take your
before we sign off, let's make sure people know where to go to check out Andrew's new book and to learn more about the Forward Party or get involved?
Sure. AndrewYang.com will direct you to a lot of this stuff. I've got a podcast. I'm on a book tour right now, forwardparty.com for the Forward Party. But let's do it. I mean, really, if you look up what's our genuine path forward right now? I mean, there is no path forward. It's just like a muddled mess, at least politically. So let's create that path that so many Americans want. There's nothing stopping us from going around the country, flipping the incentives, saying that, look, we should have open primaries and ranked choice voting. What is the counter argument? Like that the parties are awesome, that things should stay exactly the same? Like it's a really weird status quo argument. Like let's actually get together and make the changes that we want to see. That's forwardparty.com. But yeah, great to be here with you all. And we're going to do this again.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you, Silas. This has been a terrific conversation. And for any and everybody who is listening, who is not a member of Braver Angels, join us. You can find us at braverangels.org. Like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. As ever, we are building a house united. Until next time.